But that's okay. This week, we're going to wrap up a series we started several weeks ago called Prophets and Pandemics, where we're taking some time and looking at a big picture view of the prophets, right? And especially the role of the prophets, because what we've seen is that the job of the prophets, if you're really going to kind of sum it up in a big, broad way, is to be the spokesperson for God. And the reason I think this is interesting is because when you stop and think about it, that's our job, isn't it? That as followers of Jesus, our responsibility, our job is to share the good news of Jesus with the world around us, that we are to be the same spokesperson for God. And so what we're doing through this series is just kind of looking at the prophets and saying, okay, wait, how are they doing that? So that we can understand how we can share the good news of Jesus in our world, even though we're going through a pandemic and all the craziness that goes along with it. And so this week, as we wrap up, I wanted to take some time and look at a prophet that's kind of lesser known, right? This is one of those that, to be honest, it's a shorter book. It's really easy to skip over. You guys ever do that when you're trying to find a book? You just like totally skip over a whole bunch? Like this is one of those. It's like, you know how people call the Midwest the flyover part of the country? This is like the read over part. We don't usually look at this prophet, but I want to take some time and look at it. So if you've got your Bible, do me a favor, turn to the book of Habakkuk in chapter 1. Yeah, I know, right? Like, wait, that's in the Bible? Yes, it's in the Bible. Habakkuk chapter 1. If you have some trouble finding it, it's cool. I had a little trouble too. The best way to find it is to start at Matthew. And just start turning to the left. It's the fifth from last book of the Old Testament. Again, Habakkuk chapter 1. And while you're turning there, just a little bit of review as far as like what's happening in the story so far. Because Israel is going through one of those seasons of life where they've completely strayed from God. Right? This is one of those patterns, those reoccurring patterns that we see all throughout the Bible, isn't it? That Israel falls away from God. They try to do things their way. It doesn't work out very well. They eventually hit rock bottom. They realize that things have gotten out of control. They call out to God for help. God redeems them in one way or another. And then they're good for a while, right? Okay, I messed up. I'm not going to do that again. We're good, God. They have this good relationship, but then what happens? The pattern repeats. It's this cycle that we see over and over and over again. We see it all throughout the prophets. We see it in the book of Judges. I think the book of Judges is like the best example of this, isn't it? Because in this one book, you see Israel fall and return to God just time after time after time. But the reason I think this is important is because we do the same thing. Can we just be honest about that? Like we do the same thing when it comes to God. There are these times in our life when we're like, okay, God, I'm going to do things my way. And so we do things our way for a while, but it doesn't work out the way that we wanted it to work out. Eventually the bottom falls out, and we realize we're in a mess. So we cry out to God, God, please help. God does a work, and eventually he brings us out of that moment. We're like, okay, I'm good. Like I've got this good relationship with God again. I'm not going to mess it up. Like this time is going to be different. This time I'm not going to mess it up again. But what happens? Usually one of two things. Either we forget how bad it was before, and we go back to the same mess, or a new mess comes along, and we say, oh, but this is going to be different. Anybody ever do that? This is going to be different. This isn't going to be like the way it was before. This is a completely new situation, but it's not. And we find ourselves right back in that same mess, the same cycle. The reason it's important that we take time and look at the difficult books of the Bible like the prophets is because their story is our story. They struggle with the same things we struggle with. And for Israel, and especially Judah right now, because Habakkuk is a prophet to the southern part of Israel known as the kingdom of Judah, they are in one of those moments where they have turned away from God. Things are bad, things are out of control, and that's where we're going to pick up. Habakkuk, if you're there, chapter 1. Beginning in verse 1, says this, the prophecy that Habakkuk the prophet received. Fun little side note, the word prophecy here, some of your Bibles translate that as oracle. Either or works. But this is kind of a fun word in Hebrew. Because in Hebrew, this word literally translates into weight or burden. Because it's not easy being a spokesperson for God. There is a weight and a burden that comes with the responsibility of being called by God. There is a weight and a burden whenever God calls us to step outside of our comfort zone and do something. There is a weight with responsibility. What did Uncle Ben say in Spider-Man? With great power comes what? There we go. Come on, somebody. The Gospel of Uncle Ben. Never mind. Anyway, it's hard. And we're going to see that as we look at the prophecy of Habakkuk. Now, before we go forward, Habakkuk's a little bit different. It's like this conversation between the prophet and God. And we see this here in verse 2. Habakkuk talking to God. He says this, "How long, Lord, must I call out for help, but you don't listen? Or cry out to you violence, but you don't save? Why do you make me look at injustice or tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore, the law is paralyzed. Justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous so that justice is perverted." One thing I want you to notice is that Habakkuk starts a little bit different than every other prophet. You see, the prophets are usually about a prophet telling the people about God. This begins with the prophet telling God about the people. So he's talking with God. The whole thing is this conversation. I want you to notice, Habakkuk seems to be a little bit of a complainer, isn't he? Like he's looking around, and he's like, God, are you paying attention? Do you see what's happening around you? He's complaining, but he's got a bit of a point, doesn't he? Because things are out of control. And in fact, notice in verse 2, he says, "I cry out violence, but you don't save." This word for violence here is a very, very important word. It's a word that if you've been with us this year, we talked about all the way back in January. Remember when we looked at the story of Noah and the ark and the flood? In Genesis chapter 6, verse 11, it says that the whole earth was filled with violence. The word violence there is the word Hamas. That's our word here. Hamas is a word that means like violence for the sake of violence. Violence for the fun of it. You ever watch a movie where you've got some bullies that are like picking on somebody? It's like they're enjoying it. Like they're doing it for fun. That's the idea here. Violence for the sake of violence. Violence for the fun of it. And in fact, oftentimes this word Hamas is a word that's used to describe the opposite of justice, which is interesting because then jump ahead and look at verse 4. In verse 4, the wicked hem in the righteous so that justice is perverted. You want to know how bad and out of control things are in this moment in Judah? Things are so bad, so out of control that people are committing this violence against other people, but they're calling it justice. They're saying that this violence is actually a good thing. Everything has gotten out of control. And so Habakkuk is pleading with God, God, how long is this going to happen? When are you going to do something? The big question, the big problem that Habakkuk has, and I think this is one that all of us struggle with at some point. God, why do you let the wicked prevail? Why do you let the wicked prevail? It's a fair question. Notice what it says in verse 5. God responds. I love this response, by the way. This sounds so good. Here's what God says. He says, look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed. For I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe even if you were told. Doesn't that sound awesome? Let's just be real for a minute. How many of you are here today or you're watching with us online and you want to see God work like that in your life? How many of you are here today and you want to be utterly amazed by God? Or how many of you are watching online and you want to see God do something that is so big, so jaw-dropping, mind-blowing, that even if God told you about it ahead of time, you wouldn't have even believed it? Like, I don't know about you, but that's the relationship I want with God. I want to see God do things that just amaze me. Anyone else? Careful what you ask for, though. Just might get it. Let's see what God says next. Look at verse 6. Here's the utterly amazing, jaw-dropping, mind-blowing thing that God's going to do. I am raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth and seize dwellings that are not their own. They are a feared and dreaded people. They are a law unto themselves and promote their own honor. Their horses are swifter than leopards, not lepers, that would be weird. Fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallops headlong. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle swooping to devour. They all come intent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind and gather prisoners like sand. They mock kings and scoff at rulers. They laugh at the fortified cities. By building earthen ramps, they capture them. They sweep past like a wind and go on. Guilty people whose own strength is their God. Wait, what? I mean, who's with me? Like, God says he's going to do this big, incredible, mind-blowing, jaw-dropping thing, but he's going to raise up the Babylonians. And essentially what God is saying here is that he's going to use the Babylonians to bring judgment against Israel. To which we're like, wait, how does that help? Right? Like, how does that make things better? I'm not an expert by any means, but that actually seems worse, doesn't it? Like, God is basically going to use a greater wicked nation to bring judgment against a lesser wicked nation. It feels backwards to me. How about you? We live in a culture that always says choose the lesser of two evils, right? We say this every 4 years. It's about the lesser of two evils. And so in our minds, what makes sense is that God should use the lesser wicked nation to bring judgment against the greater. But God's saying, I'm going to use the greater to bring judgment against the lesser. How does that help? After all, the big problem that Habakkuk had is that wickedness seems to prosper. This actually seems to make things worse, not better. What is going on? And Habakkuk is going to raise that same question. But he does it in like a very Bible-y sort of way. We're going to begin in verse 12 here. But let me ask you something before we get into this. Have you ever, and I know we never admit this in church, but have you ever been mad at God? And you were going to have one of those like hard prayers with God, but you didn't want to start off too rough. Do you guys do that, or is that just me? And so you got to build up to it, right? You start off with all the formalities, talking about how good God is. And it's like you're building up. And sometimes it's like you're trying to get through the formalities so that you can get to the punchline. That's kind of what he's doing here. Listen, verse 12. Habakkuk says, Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, you will never die. You, Lord, have appointed them to execute judgment. You, my rock, have ordained them to punish. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. He's buttering him up. Then notice what he says next. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up the more righteous than themselves? Again, Habakkuk's complaint is our complaint. God, this is actually making things worse. Why do the wicked continue to prevail while the righteous seem to be swallowed up? Then it's God's turn again. Notice what he says, jumping ahead to Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 2. Then the Lord replied, write down the revelation. Hold on to that for a minute. As you go through the prophets, it is very, very, very rare that God tells one of the prophets to write something down right now. You see the idea kind of implied later, but very rarely does God say, okay, write this down. This is important. He says this, write down the revelation and make it plain on tablets so that a herald may run with it. For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not prove false. Though it will linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and not delay. See, verse 4, the enemy is puffed up. His desires are not upright, but the righteous person will live by faithfulness. God says, I want you to write down the message I'm about to tell you. And the reason I want you to write it down is for the righteous person. Because again, what I am about to tell you, says God, is so mind-blowing that even if I told you about it ahead of time, you never would have believed it. So I want you to write it down as concrete proof. But here's the deal. It's going to be hard. It's going to delay. It's going to take a while. But the righteous person will live by their faithfulness. Basically, what he's saying here is the righteous person will wait for God to work, which is a hard thing to do, isn't it? It's hard to wait on God when it feels like the world's falling apart, which is probably how he would have felt. I mean, they're about to be conquered by a ruthless nation. It feels like the world's falling apart for him. How many of us over the last year or so have felt like the world has fallen apart? As we've watched things happen on social media, as we've watched our lives, for some of us, we've lost our jobs. Our worlds have been turned upside down. It feels like the world's falling apart. And the problem is, and you guys know this, whenever things feel out of control, how many of us feel that innate need to do something about it? There's this thing inside of us that says, okay, but I got to speak up. I've got to say something. I've got to do something about it. How many of us over the last year or so have felt the need, have felt compelled to say something about masks or vaccines or about a political view or something like that over the last year or so? Right? Whenever the world is falling apart, we feel this innate need to do something about it. And what God is saying here is, wait, because I'm about to do something amazing, but don't get ahead of yourselves. It's going to take a while. It's going to linger. But I'm about to blow your mind. The faithful wait for God to work. Which raises a question, how? Hold on to that. We're going to circle around and answer that question in just a second. Because then, from verses 5 forward, God begins to explain what he's going to do. God says, I'm going to bring judgment against Babylon itself. Don't miss this. Babylon will fall. Now for us, that's ancient history. Cool. So what? For them, Babylon was that nation that would never be defeated. That was going to reign forever. They were just this massive superpower. Nobody could ever imagine Babylon falling, and yet God is going to use this judgment to bring judgment against a greater nation. And the reason I think this is so important is because for God, God doesn't want us to settle for the lesser of two evils. God wants to purify both nations. But it's going to take some time. It's going to take some work. And it's going to be hard. For Israel, they're going to have to go through a hard time. But God says, I am working in the mess. I am working in the brokenness. I am working in the judgment. And then Habakkuk responds. Notice what he says here. Jumping ahead. Again, we're doing a big view of Habakkuk, so we're jumping a bit. Habakkuk 3, verse 2. It says, Lord, I've heard of your fame and I stand in awe of your deeds. Lord, repeat them in our day. In our time, make them known. In wrath, remember mercy. Come on, somebody. God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. His glory covered the heavens and his praise filled the whole earth. Now, I know for some of us, we read that and we're like, okay, that just sounds good. But he's actually getting to something very, very important here. In Hebrew, there's such a thing known as the significance of the first use of a word or a phrase. If you've been with us before, this is something that we've talked about from time to time, but not super often. The idea here is whenever something significant happens the first time in a place, or you see a word used for the first time in a significant way, that kind of becomes like the outlier for it. And then as you go through the Bible, people will reference that over and over and over. And I want you to notice here the reference to Mount Paran, because this is actually key to understanding what Habakkuk is trying to say. And this is actually going to get to the point of how we learn to be patient and wait on God when it feels like the world is falling apart. See, the question we need to ask ourselves is, where else in the Bible does it talk about Mount Paran? What significant event, what significant moment happens there? Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 2, we see that Moses is giving his final farewell speech. He's about to die. And so he gathers all of Israel together. And I want you to notice specifically what he says in verse 7 regarding Judah, which, by the way, Habakkuk's the prophet to Judah. Verse 7, and this is what he said about Judah. Hear, Lord, the cry of Judah. Bring him to his people. With his own hands he defends his cause. Oh, be a help to his foes. He's basically saying, God, help them as they're dealing with enemies. See, Habakkuk is here in this moment saying, God, in the same way that you were going to help Judah again with their enemies. But the question we have to ask is, how is God going to help them? Habakkuk, as he goes forward through the rest of that chapter, goes into this big, long, poetic description of the Exodus story. You remember the story. Once Israel was slaves in Egypt, but God redeemed them by conquering the mighty Pharaoh, the mighty Egypt. And in the same way, Israel's about to find themselves in a difficult place again. They're about to find themselves in a new slavery. But Habakkuk is asking God to repeat himself as he did in the past. And just as God redeemed Israel from Egypt and defeated Pharaoh, in the same way, he says God is going to defeat Babylon and do a new thing and redeem his people. And the thing that I want you to notice here is the change in Habakkuk from the beginning to the end. Because when we picked up, we talked about how he is a complainer, right? He was cynical. He was doubtful. But here, as we look at chapter 3, we see that he's a person who is filled with hope. You see, it's easy to be cynical. We live in a culture that thrives on cynicism, don't we? If you don't believe me, open Twitter. Look at Facebook. You can't post anything without somebody arguing, right? Why? Because we live in a culture that's always looking to be cynical. We're always looking to pick other people apart. It's easy to be cynical, but we are called to be people of hope. We are called to be people who carry the good news of Jesus into the world, no matter how broken, no matter how hopeless it is, how much things feel like and seem like they're falling apart. We are to be the herald of that message. And we cannot do that if we remain cynical. We are called to be people who bring hope. And the way that we hold on to hope when the world is falling apart is by remembering God's word and the way that God has worked in the past. This is what Hezekiah is doing. He says, okay, this is bad, but God's done this before. He's got this. He can totally handle this a second time and a third time and a fourth time. If God could repair that, imagine what he could do in this moment. And by the way, if God could redeem Israel from Babylon, from all that mess, imagine what God wants to do right now. In the midst of a pandemic, when it feels like the world is falling apart, what if this is the moment when God is positioning his people to make the biggest difference, the biggest impact in the world? But we cannot do that through cynicism. We cannot do that through hatred and doubt. We've got to be people who hold on to hope. After all, how can you bring the good news of Jesus to the world around you? How can you be the herald of hope if you don't have hope? We are called to share the good news. And so let me just ask you as we wrap up, where do you see hope? It's not always big. It's not always obvious. Sometimes it's just glimmers. But are we looking for it? Or have we become so conditioned over the last year to focus on what's wrong, what's broken? Have we become so conditioned over the last year to focus on cynicism that we've lost the ability to see the good? It's like being nearsighted. You ever have that moment where you read a book and you got the book right here and then you look up and everything's blurry? Please tell me that happens to other people, or I'm just need glasses, which is probably true. We do the same thing with cynicism. We hold cynicism so close to our face that we can't even see the good things that God's doing around us. My challenge for you this week, and for you online, you don't get out of this. Look for the hope. Look for the good. Because we've been given the burden of bringing the good news of Jesus to the world, but we have to begin with hope. And to start there, we've got to look past and work past our cynicism. Where do you see hope? Where do you see God moving? Look for it this week. Let's pray. God, thank you for today. And more than anything, thank you that you're up to something. I'm reminded of one of my favorite quotes by one of my favorite authors. She says, remain suspicious that God is up to something. God, help us to remain suspicious that you're up to something, even when it feels like and it seems like things are just crazy, things are falling apart, the price of lumber's high. God, it's easy to be cynical, but where are you working, God? Condition our eyes to not focus on what's wrong, but to focus on you and where you're at and what you're doing. Because just as you redeemed Israel from the brokenness and the captivity of Babylon, so you're going to do a work in our life today. God, thank you that you're faithful. That just as you worked in the past, you're working today. God, remind us that when we remember what you did in the past, it gives us hope for the present. God, give us new eyes. Remove the shackles. Eyes to see what you're up to. Eyes that see hope. For it's in Jesus' name we pray.